Well, so let me start by saying how lovely this opportunity is. We're very grateful to be here. Very grateful to Yonsei University and to the University of Geneva for giving us the opportunity to get together. And yeah, so for me, the kind of goal with this was that, well, I wanted to kind of enable us to find potential places for collaboration or just to brainstorm about that together. Which means, first of all, that questions are very welcome. So I'm very happy to have the questions during. This is not a research talk. Now, what I ended up doing, it's a little bit of a mixture of things. So partly, I thought it kind of makes sense to try to, so to speak, map some territory that, so to speak, connects where I imagine each of your interests are and activities are to my own, kind of filling in bits in the middle. That's one way to think of it. And another way to think of it is, since there's no such thing as a neutral overview or a survey or so, and it very, very much matters how we each are thinking about things, that of course I will talk about my own research, so I'll be kind of giving bits of research talks, so to speak, in abbreviated form. And yeah, so I hope some of it will seem relevant, and we can talk about whatever you like, of course, in the Q&A. Okay, so to start, this is the plan for today. So the three master classes will build on each other. It's a sort of a story. But so for the day, in a way, today is the most overviewy kind of talk, and it's basically in three parts. I would say, so the beginning part, where I say the ABCs of time, an introduction to temporal metaphysics, and now of course it's not, this is not really new to any of you, but it also means that I have the opportunity to tell you how I think of temporal metaphysics. And so then, from then on, I picked some work by Baptiste, who has, like some of you already, explored some of these interconnections. And then, that part is partly kind of my thoughts on some of the work, and that means it then kind of organically leads into some work that I've done in effectively meta-ontology, which some of us have already, some of you know, just to kind of talk about that a little bit and see where we stand. So that's one part, and then in 4, it's a little bit of, it's a topic that's it's related but new in that this will be about Kit Fine's approach to temporal metaphysics, which I take to be relevant for reasons that maybe I'll get to later on. So Fine approaches to temporal passage, to the passing of time, and then kind of related to that, some of Oliver Cooley's work on how passing of time might be thought of in the context of relativity theory. And then the final part, the third part, if you will, kind of leads into more present or more recent and ongoing work, where I'm going to be talking about what I take Craig Callender's vision for philosophy of time to be. And actually I'm going to talk, in particular his book, What Makes Time Special, and I'm going to talk about that more tomorrow, for reasons that I hope to make clear at the end of the talk. Okay, so, and maybe just as an orientation, so apologies for this, I'm talking about my own work a lot. There was no way around it because there's no neutral way of kind of picking the topics or picking where potential collaborations might happen. So, this is basically what I will touch on in terms of what I've worked on or what's going on now. Yeah, so to begin with, just step back a little. Why philosophy of quantum gravity? Well, as we've been hearing, and as we know, it's something like this. How does Tsubara Goethe say? It's the premise of our work that philosophy and physics are intertwined, so that advances in physics entail revisions in philosophy, but also require conceptual, that is, philosophical advance and refinement. So it's a sort of two-way fruitful interaction between philosophy and physics in general, and in this context in particular. It's the introduction to the one space-time. And so they also say, and this distinction is a somewhat hazy one, kind of like the distinction between taking the frontiers of physics, looking there for answers to philosophical questions, versus bringing philosophical tools and expertise to help formulate theories at those frontiers. But yeah, so philosophy beyond space-time is a little bit more devoted to the first task, and beyond space-time a bit more to the second. Okay, so that's why philosophy of quantum gravity. Now, why temporal metaphysics and philosophy of quantum gravity? Here's a quote by Callender and Huggett. I say, amongst other things, quantum gravity forces us to challenge some of our deepest assumptions about the physical world. They all approach questions that are discussed by philosophers. How should we understand general covariance? They say also, what's the nature of time and change? Can there be a theory of the universe? Boundary conditions, must space and time be fundamental? I've highlighted this middle question because, to my mind, it sort of sums up the territory that the temporal metaphysics aims to occupy. What's the nature of time and change? And maybe I could have highlighted the last sentence also. The question here might there be the same two-way benefit? In other words, certainly, for temporal metaphysics, if there are questions being asked there that we want to ask, we might look to, theories of quantum gravity for answers. And I'll say a little bit more about the rationales for doing that, as others have written about. I'm not completely sure how to think about the opposite direction here, but I think we'll see a little bit of that maybe in Baptiste's paper. So the idea would be, I guess, to kind of reformulate metaphysical positions about time in the light of current and future physics. So I take this to be kind of the question for my set of master classes and the discussions that we can have afterwards. Again, it's something for us to explore in each of our positions. Okay, so to begin with, here are the ABCs of time. In brief, how I think of things. Now, this is a choice of mine to kind of think. Let's not do that. To think of this question of dynamicity as really central. Now, of course, there are lots of questions about the nature of time and change that one could ask and that have been asked. It's just that I tend to see this question as popping up again and again, as being central, a kind of central divide, running through all these discussions, and that is deliberately simplifying the metaphysical landscape. We can talk about that too. So the question would be, is time dynamic in a way space is not? Does it pass, or say, does it robustly pass? Is there flow or becoming? Use these terms interchangeably, and I mean for this to include any purported ideas about a genuinely open future. In other words, in some sense, metaphysically open future. I take that to be also part of this divide, which again,
Natalja,
yes.
I mean, you're robustly there. I heard people say robustly in connection with that. It sounds like a term of art. Is there any particular reason people often say robustly there?
Yes.
And there's ways for it to non-robustly?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's actually, there is a reason, and that reason is very close to my own research interests. Let me get onto that in a moment, briefly. I mean, I will talk more about the answer to your question actually in second and third talks, but I will say a little bit about it in a moment. Thank you. So for now, I want to say, let's just think of this as the basic divide, dynamic versus non-dynamic models, metaphysical models of time, views of time, A versus B theoretic, where the P theoretic one I'm also going to call block universe view. Going a little bit to the roots, and I'll say a little bit about the history in a moment. The terminology, of course, goes back to MacTaggart, a British idealist. The idea on the A-theoretic side, roughly speaking, is that there are more than perspectival temporal properties. In other words, presentness, pastness, futurity, those kinds of properties are not just a matter of temporal perspective, unlike, let's say, terms like here or there, which merely express spatial perspective. In other words, there are objective, metaphysically special properties like this. On the other side, all there are B theoretic relations such as simultaneity and succession, relational terms. And of course, already you can tell there's some sort of completion intended here at the fundamental level or something like that, or really, because of course, in some sense there's both. But so the idea is, what ultimately constitutes the nature of time. Just to kind of say that also, there is a C theory, there are C theoretic approaches to time. So the way I've set this up, B theoretic approaches deny that time passes in this robust sense, but they can still agree that time is directed in some sense. C theories deny not only passage but also direction. For reasons that don't have to detain us here, I think a lot of the people who have been self-describing as B theorists might well, in the light of current literature on C theory, actually think of themselves as C theorists instead, because there's variation in the B theoretic camp about how to think of the nature of temporal relations, like succession. And so for that reason, even though I'm not going to say anything specifically about the C theory, probably much of what I'll say about the B's also applies to the C's. Okay, now we pause briefly. As you may already be able to tell, the reason the robust label comes about, and this is with Brad Scow in his book on objective becoming, comes up with this label, is to oppose it to anemic becoming, or anemic passage, which merely consists in B theoretic temporal relations. In other words, if at the fundamental level you are merely positing earlier or later, or simultaneity, that kind of temporal relation, then you are leaving something out that one might posit. So if you want to call that the passing of time, okay, but that's not what we meant. The idea is, A theory is meant to posit something else. And so we're going to separate those two by having two different labels. And then what passage was supposed to be about was robust passage, which consists in, I would say, it's a little hard to say in general because there's so many different kinds of A theories, but it's something like a transfer of metaphysical privilege. Like, for example, on the moving spotlight view, in some sense, all of space-time, let's say, for now, all of time exists, and one time is objectively present, but which time it has that privilege changes. Or presentism, the metaphysical privilege would be ontological, namely being the only time that exists, on the growing block theory being the latest time that exists, and so on and so on. So, yeah, does it make a little bit more? Okay, I will come back to this point later. Okay, now a little bit very potted history. In some sense, the origins of the dispute go back to the pre-Socratics. So Heraclitus proclaimed that everything is in flux, while Parmenides seems to have denied the reality of change. So in some ways this mirrors the contemporary A-B divide, but take care because contemporary B theorists don't take themselves to be denying the reality of change, only of passage. So a lot of the dispute was already about, is time dynamic in addition to, are there more than just temporal relations at the fundamental level? I mentioned already various positions in temporal ontology, roughly the study of which times exists, presentism, come back to this in a moment, but roughly the view that only the present exists, growing block, the view that the past and the present exist and the future does not, reality grows. And eternalism, a view that something like all times exist, come back to this too. Depending on your approach to various historical thinkers, you may also think that they have historical roots. Perhaps it's clearest in the case of the growing block, which C.B. Broad, for instance, famously developed in detail. Okay, and so just to get the terminology down again, what I'm taking to be the B theory has the eternalism built into it, but also says that at the fundamental level there are nothing but relations. So there are eternalist A theories too. Now, this bit of history, probably very familiar. McTaggart famously argued that time was unreal, and his argument, that's how we get the ABC terminology, makes use of these two ways of thinking of events in world history. On one hand, you can think of them as being earlier or later than each other, you get the B series, or you can think of them as past, present, and future, then you get the A series, or really rather lots of A series, depending on where the present is. Now, just as a side comment, even someone like Callender, who is not a big fan of thinking in these ways about time, points out that something reminiscent of this distinction is used outside of philosophy. I think he mentioned that psychologists and linguists kind of make a similar distinction, where the notion of deictic time is involves a temporal reference point. So if you think of that as coinciding with the now, that's kind of McTaggart's A series, as opposed to allocentric time, that time of calendars, for example, and so on, that don't have a temporal reference point in them. So why don't we, have make both of these distinctions? And McTaggart already said that the metaphysical question kind of comes up only when we ask, if we ask, which of these is fundamental. In other words, whether you can, have temporal relations, whether you can even have a B series without the A series. So McTaggart thought, no, you cannot. It's in fact the A plus the C series that give rise to the B series. So, roughly speaking, this is the question: can there be time without an A series? As is probably clear, just the difference is that a B fact, if you like our drinking the lemonade precedes this talk. You're hearing what I'm saying right now. That doesn't change. It doesn't itself change that temporal fact. Whereas, our now drinking the lemonade and this bit of the talk being future, that changes. Right? That's the distinction. So now, suppose that we wonder about kinds of connection between this kind of question about the nature of time and theories of quantum gravity. And like I said, I'm interested in this paper by because he's done this kind of thing. Now, and I mean, the sort of what I'm going to be telling you is sort of questions that come up for me when I read his paper. They come up for me for reasons that will become clear, but this is not something I've thought about a lot. It's just the beginning of the discussion. So he helpfully distinguishes between two things that you might think are worthwhile doing here in general. For like metaphysicians looking at theories of quantum gravity, the epistemologically ambitious route investigates the ontological upshots of findings that are common to all approaches to quantum gravity, say non-locality, or that the world can be locally split into quasi-spatial and quasi-temporal structure. That would be the ambitious route versus the modest route, which aims for conditional upshots for ontology. In other words, we look at the metaphysical upshots or ontological upshots of particular theories of quantum gravity that might still be worth doing. I think so too. And along the modest route, he argues that so on a particular on a two-dimensional field ontology interpretation, string theory implies that there are no longer objective durations. I'm not going to talk about that part as much because I take the argument for B to be kind of more central in the paper. So B is that loop quantum gravity implies that there is no longer an objective partial ordering of events. We call that disordered locality. Okay, so these are upshots of those theories, argues, and then we can ask what would be the implications of these upshots for the nature of time. Let's say for temporal ontology. Now the way that I read this is that I take the goal to be kind of twofold. It's both to adjudicate between these isms that we've just heard about in temporal ontology, and, where appropriate, in the light of these theories, to suitably reinterpret them. Which, of course, in the light of other established physical theories, we also have to do in a way. I think these are both really worthwhile. I'm a little worried about doing both at once, or I think that's kind of roughly the root of some of my questions, but these are, of course, both good goals. So as for conclusions, first of all, he regards both presentism and the growing block view as, he gestures to existing critiques, that say that neither of these a-priori views is tenable in the light of, special relativity, general relativity is not tenable in the light of cosmology or theories of quantum gravity. But then he says, so then he considers, but what about eternalism? And so again, I really agree that, just because we've ruled out presentism in a theory of quantum gravity, that doesn't mean we should now be eternalists about that theory of quantum gravity. So let's agree with that too. Just to kind of, before I list the conclusions as I understand them, the first thing he says is actually that so if we now think about the loss of partial ordering of events in quantum gravity, he says, that's really, he says that's kind of much more radical than anything that's commonly found in philosophy of time. He cites work on B theory and C theory. Just a small thought on that. I think in a way those are the wrong places to look because those are still intended to be theories of time. There is actually a little bit of literature on a D theory, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that as well. There's work on theories of timelessness. But anyway, the next thing he says is, even in loop quantum gravity, there's still a local split between quasi-spatial and quasi-temporal structures that's preserved. So actually nothing too radical after all, it seems. And then he says we can set aside as merely linguistic the question of what's essential to time, like whether a partial ordering is a necessary feature for time, and instead ask, do we have enough of time in order to express the classical ontological views? Okay, so then that's how we get to the conclusion, which I take to be as follows.
Just a small note that the partial ordering, of course, is already lost in GR, so that we don't need to go to quantum gravity. Because we have closed timeline curves, for instance, in some.
I think he means. I mean, which I can't assess, but I think he means we only ever have statistically approximate temporal orderings of events in quantum gravity. No matter which model. So suppose that's the case. So I can't assess that. I'm just talking conditionally. Like supposing that's the case, so the conclusion for temporal ontology is supposed to be on the one hand that string theory entails standard B eternalism, all times exists, for reasons that I'm not going to talk about here. That loop quantum gravity now entails a novel position, which he calls atemporal eternalism. And so, so he thinks standard B eternalism, as I understand him, is ruled out in loop quantum gravity because it requires more than a statistically approximate temporal ordering of events. Okay, so about this, so just to kind of be clear on the significance of this, the overall conclusion then is that because both of these theories of quantum gravity vindicate some version of eternalism, therefore overall eternalism is empirically vindicated in the context of these physical theories. So, I mean, my musings at this point in time over that, about that. So I think that conclusion really requires, for example, atemporal eternalism to be a species of eternalism. That's important. Like we have to have some, and he says a lot about that. So we have to have some, in fact, core of eternalism that atemporal eternalism can be a species of, so that they both count as versions of the same view. So atemporal eternalism. And let me actually go to the next slide where I've written down my questions about this. Okay, so atemporal eternalism says all proper parts of the natural world exist implicita, and the material content of the natural world does not depend on any vantage point in the atemporal structure. So I guess, to metaphysicians' ears, maybe first of all that's a really interesting statement. But then lots of other questions, like, for example, what is this opposed to? How would, the material content of the natural world depend on any, or on a vantage point in an atemporal structure? And actually, how to think about vantage points in that kind of structure? Now, about standard eternalism, has a number of different formulations. Past, present, and future entities exist simpliciter, that's very common, or it is what we locally regard as simpliciter. All natural things exist independent of their location in the network of spatio-temporal relations. And existence simpliciter does not depend on the temporal location within the temporal structure. So, I mean, I think this partly leads into some worries that I have about temporal ontology anyway, which Chris has heard me talk about, I'll talk about in a moment. Again, the kind of challenge I think is to say what you can mean by this so that a presentist will have to disagree. And I'll come back to standard eternalism on the next slide. The core of eternalism says existence implicita does not depend on any vantage point in the temporal or atemporal structure. Existence is not a local matter. It's not restricted to our immediate spatial temporal surroundings. And obvious questions which he has a few things to say about it, but nonetheless, one of my remaining questions are, how to think about our surroundings, the location, our surroundings and local, actually, in a way that's neutral between non-spatiotemporal and spatiotemporal structures. And then also the person independently of the location in the non-spatiotemporal structure, or the question is whose, right? And what does it mean to disagree? So these are questions that I have for reading this paper, just to make this a little bit more concrete when it comes to standard eternalism. I mean, at least in the face of it, it's not. The disagreement isn't really about how things exist. All natural things exist independently of their location in the network of spatio-temporal relations. Even if I knew what it means to deny that, to think they exist dependently in that way, I'm not sure about how to read this as mapping onto the presentism-eternalism dispute. And I'm again worried that presentists could agree with this. Similarly, and this really is reading into the next talk, past, present, future exists impliciter. Okay, so now if I try to kind of parse that, I could try to say, for all x, if x is past, present, or future, it exists. Presentists probably will agree, because they just don't think that there is anything in the domain, in the ontological domain, that is past or future. Or what about for all x, if x is not present, it doesn't exist, it doesn't work either. And similarly for the third formulation. So again, these are just questions, and so I talk about these because I'm really interested in this kind of work, and because I guess I wanted to point to some kind of meta-ontological concerns that I've had about temporal ontology anyway, which probably just will influence how I would approach possible work in this area. So this is a 2018 paper. Let's go back to the very beginning and say, okay, so presentism and eternalism. Right? They say things like only the present exists, only the present time, and only things at the present time exist. So now, for a long time, people have pushed this triviality challenge, in particular in response to presentists. They have said, well, what can you be meaning? If exists means exists now, yeah, only things that exist now exist now. If it means has existed, exists now, or will exist, then clearly that's trivially false. Just think about dinosaurs, that kind of challenge. Now, certain strands of the literature converge on the response that what we mean is existence simpliciter. Sometimes people talk about tenseless existence as well, but say existence simpliciter. So, to use a metaphor by Joshua University, even when the quantifier's wings are stretched as wide as they can be, no non-present things are caught by it. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you in an abbreviated form what I say in this paper, which is really hard because as soon as you abbreviate a paper, it's hard to make argument. But so what I want to say about this still is that it's not. It's like we're kind of applying some logical notions to time, and it's not obvious in the abstract how to understand this, like which aspect of time we thematize. And in the paper I say that's this puzzlement about what either side is saying. In other words, what's at stake remains for me, even when I kind of digest various attempts to elucidate. And so I look at three different ones: Tom Stoneham's, I won't talk about here, Ted Sider's, I'll say a little bit about, and Chris's, which is more physics-based. So let's just say a little bit about this. Obviously, Ted Sider tries to elucidate this by with reference to his broader metaphysical framework, where what's at stake is, yes, ontology, but also, prior to that, ideology. In other words, there is a question about whether tense operators, in addition to quantifiers, carve nature at the joints. And so, in a nutshell, the difference will be that an eternalist will assent to there exists an X that is a dinosaur, and a presentist will not. And instead, they will only assent to there exists an X that is a dinosaur. So the joint carving machinery requires kind of intricate argumentation back and forth, but I think the essence of my puzzlement is still, even if the world has quantificational structure, I guess I don't really know what it means about time to say one or the other, because remember, both of these sides, they agree on the dinosaur-related facts, they agree, on history and so on. And so it's like, I would like to know more about what it means to disagree about the shape of nature's temporal joints. That's the metaphysician's elucidation. Now here's the physics-based one. Okay, so you might think, and probably you do think, there's plenty of room for disagreement. If we accept that there exists a proper subset relation between the set of events of the presentist and the corresponding eternalist set. I think maybe ultimately the disagreement here is that I think that it's sort of important to my mind to keep in mind the charity constraint, meaning, in other words, something like this, that I'm not going back to the triviality challenge, it's more, I don't think it can be right to attribute to the presentist the view that less than what exists, exists. That's in a nutshell, I think the situation. So in some sense, of course, the presentist posits, or wants to posit, fewer events. And then I think that's sort of a starting point, and then the question is, okay, we agree that these are historical events and other things are not. What are we disagreeing over when we wonder whether they exist, whether those events exist? In terms of thinking about this with reference to with the help of the idea of a contrast class. So we can list entities which don't physically exist, Santa Claus and so on, also pseudo-history. But then these events did happen, the presentist agrees. So again, actual history is so unlike pseudo-history that it's, for me the question remains. Here's another way to put this disagreement between us. So ultimately, you might think the answer is this. Take four-dimensional manifold with a certain topological and differential structure. Eternalism says all events in that manifold exist and stand in certain spatial-temporal relations, including in metric. Whereas presentism partitions them, the past, present, and future events, was an equivalence relation, and then restricts existence to one such privileged class, namely the ones simultaneous with the here now. And so I think it's really tempting to jump from a conflict with physics to the conclusion that there must be substance to the view because physics conflicts with one of the sides. But it seems to me that the existence claim is not part of physics, and so physics doesn't help us provide it with meaning. So if we've provided the meaning, I don't think it can come from there. Another way to put that is, the conflict with relativity theory is in the first step, which, as you can tell from a formulation of eternalism that says past, present, and future exist equally, eternalists may also take that step. And it's really the second step that constitutes presentism, which is just the subset formulation again.
Sorry, can I ask you, what do you mean by saying that physics doesn't add the existence claim?
Yes. I think that, physics doesn't really make claims about existence, full stop. I don't think of it that way. In physics, we will handle these mathematical entities and they will have physical significance. The existence claim seems to be already part of a philosophical interpretation.
But physics says the Higgs boson exists. Isn't that
Physics
an existence
implies
claim?
that, yes, that's an existence, it implies that, I think. But whether it implies eternalism, I think is much less clear.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah.
So there is that step, the complication, which in this case I take to be more complicated, I guess, than in the case of the Higgs boson. But
so to be sure, here I didn't mean to say that physics, entails eternalism or something like that. I was just trying to come up with a sort of a physics-friendly way of saying what the presentist and the eternalist disagree about.
yeah, well, so that's why I think of this as I put it, an elucidation attempt of what's at stake using physics. Now, I guess we're disagreeing about whether physics can play that role, whether it can provide an ontological dispute with meaning. To my mind, it's almost like what it can do is it can make us more confident that there is something. But I don't see how it can help us understand what the question was.
I was just using the language, basically, of physics to say in a robust, mathematically rigorous way what the disagreement is about.
Can we compare this maybe to Maudlin?
Yes.
Maudlin, at least somewhere, I think this collection of essays, has this idea of passage, which is just the attribution of passage to directedness, right? And so this is then similar to Chris, just trying to elucidate, oh no, maybe it's the wrong word,
Right.
elucidate passage within the formalism. Somehow it's being put here. But it's not from the physics, it's just a way of kind of how we put map and print.
Yeah.
Is this what's
Thank you. You asked me, is that the kind of what I mean by elucidation?
Yeah.
Yes, but so that's exactly the puzzling thing about the relation between metaphysics and physics, because, I mean, Maudlin is in a completely different place, I think, when it comes to temporal ontology than you, and hard to classify, given this whole setup.
Right.
Like, it's really, I mean, I will come back to this kind of position because I have reasons for liking it, but again, it's, I mean, so I say here, and I say this in the paper, that I don't find this elucidation attempt helps. I don't find this helps me, nor do the metaphysical ones help me. We lose the puzzlement over what the existence question and temporal ontology was supposed to be about. However, I like the idea, like I say, this two-way interaction between metaphysics and physics. I think metaphysical positions need to be given meaning. So, like, they need a context. The problem is they can have very different contexts. Physics is one, and temporal experience, for example, is another. There's supposed to be this abstract bridge. That's what metaphysics is supposed to be. But then, to my mind, there's also this problem of becoming so abstract that.
Sorry, I'm not sure how much you want to discuss it. But for instance, you could say, this is metaphysics of GR. And then there's metaphysics of string theory. Temporality of GR, temporality of string theory. And Chris does here now is temporality of GR. And that's it. Of course, how you connect this to temporality of personal experience, that's, so to speak, a bigger project, right? In general, when we do metaphysics of specific physical theory, there's always the general question how to relate this then to everything else we know about the world, right? Or is this not how I should think about this?
Thank you. I guess I was saying something that's slightly
Okay,
more worrying, namely that as soon as we're talking about metaphysics, we have aimed at universal, like, content. I don't know, maybe there could be such a thing though. What could it mean to talk about temporal ontology all by physical theory only?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, again, like I say, I like the idea of thinking of reformulations. Like, it's almost like we would want to have a reason to talk about temporal ontology that arises from the physical theory, and maybe some of what Baptiste is doing is supposed to go in that direction.
That's how I understand Baptiste and Chris usually also my stuff. I don't know. But they do this kind of metaphysics. They kind of decouple this from the world and say, assume this was true, and then they just wonder what we should think about time. But in a way, you could also say you can be presentist maybe with respect to one layer of reality if it's decoupled from another layer.
Okay.
I don't know. But maybe this is not really getting to,
that's interesting.
I'm just wondering.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I shut up.
No, that's all very much to the point. Okay. Well, I'll go on for now with. I mean, there'll be other things in a similar vein, but let's come back to this point. There's another thing that I haven't mentioned yet. It's sort of in the background. Some of these, actually, what I'm about to say sort of makes my task in that paper harder. I just feel like I should say it because it might come up. So sometimes, and including in this paper of Baptiste, and I think Chris also would favor this, sometimes the non-eternalist positions are actually presented as in principle separate from the claim that time passes, which I have not been doing. We can talk about that too. So, the idea would be that presentism only says the present exists, and let's not call it the drawing block, instead to say no futurism only says the past and present exist, and that's it. So again, I mentioned that partly because that might also where disagreements or kind of differences in direction are ultimately to be traced back to, because so if you think that this whole animation stuff, the stuff that we started with, the question of dynamicity and so on, that I started with, if you think that's saddling the presentists with something that they shouldn't be saddled with, and that it ultimately causes all these interpretative problems, then you might look at this differently. I guess, insofar as I understand these positions, I do see presentism as tied to passage. I think, if you ask yourself, okay, so like which time is present? Is it this one, or this one, or this one? None of those answers are going to be the one the presentist intends. I see the dynamicity as built in, and I have other reasons, which we can come back to at the end if you want, for thinking this doesn't ultimately help elucidate. Some of those reasons I go into in the paper, and others I will tell you about.
I agree that that's the normal way to understand presentism.
My way?
Your way, yes.
Okay.
I think so. This is very unusual, and I couldn't name somebody who defends this Parmenidean version of presentism.
Oh, I'm sure there's others. I'm sure you're not the only one. I'm sure you're not the only one, but
I'm not defending it anyway. I'm just sort of proposing this as a logical possibility.
Okay. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about what that says? I mean, you just said it only the present exists, but
right, and it doesn't change or it doesn't renew itself.
So you really mean like one time, like you want to pick
something like this, yes.
That, of course, I see is a logical possibility. I don't think that that's what presentist. I mean, I can't think of a presentist that has wanted to endorse that.
No, I agree with that. Yes,
Okay.
I agree with that.
Okay.
But
okay.
I'm just saying that
it would be a position worthy of being called presentism, because they agree with the standard form of presentism that only the present exists.
But wouldn't it by now be past, whichever time that was? So shouldn't it be pastism by now?
No. I guess you don't have any passage, so you don't. The present has not passed.
You do have. Okay. So you're going to pick one time, like you're going to say.
Well, there is just one time.
I'm not sure if I understand the position you have in mind. The one that I thought you were pointing to would kind of pick a time by date, and then by that, that time will then no longer. But maybe that's not.
The position would just be that everything that exists now. There are only present events and entities, and there's no passage, no becoming, no dynamicity, or whatever you want to call it, in that. You're under an illusion that there is such a thing. I mean, you have to then come up with a sort of story explaining the phenomenology. I'm not tempted to deliver that story. I'm not attracted to that position. And I don't know of anybody who defensively like that, but it would be a presentist view in the sense that they would agree with standard presentism that what exists are only present events and present entities.
Can you give me an example of a present event or a present entity, or is that not on that view?
I guess any existing event would be your lecture right now.
This conversation, like this moment.
This conversation, I guess, but
I mean, it's pretty close. So what you're saying is pretty close to just like the Parmenidean right?
so it would have to be a Parmenidean thing. Presumably a Parmenidean would then say like, no, actually the lecture and its passing and so forth, that's all at the non-fundamental level of some sort of illusions. What fundamentally exists
That's interesting.
is the one and only ever unchanging thing.
And it is like that moment that we had a moment ago.
And that is a momentary thing.
Yeah, so I mean, this is again something that I don't think has been explored, but at that kind of moment in the debate, I feel like that sounds pretty close to what I thought eternalism was, except somehow the contents are much more. I don't know, maybe I'm misunderstanding stuff.
Maybe in some sense it would be maybe related to eternalism because it denies passage, but there would be a disagreement about the ontology because the eternalists would say, like, no, are you crazy? Not just presently existing things exist.
Yeah, so I mean, I totally agree. If you really mean that moment was the only one that existed, that's the view, that's a logical possibility. And I think I do understand how that differs from eternalism. I don't think that's what any presentist had in mind, but
No,
maybe it's
I agree with that.
worse.
Yeah, I don't think I've never met anybody who had that.
Opinions don't matter by themselves. We can call it presentism. That's
Sure.
Yeah, and it's
But I understand. So, like, this view would differ from eternalism.
I think
in the sense of like the ontology. So, like, wouldn't it be like extension of agreement? Wouldn't it be a sort of block view as well? Like it would differ just by saying like people will say like no, just what is present exists, but like in a sense everything is present. No?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it's at least logically possible where if somebody is saying the sum total of everything that exists are just present entities. Time maybe consists just as one moment, the now. And that everything in that moment exists and nothing else. And eternalists would disagree with that. So this is crazy. But of course, there's a certain temporal structure. It's not exactly what the standard presentist claims, but maybe there's like a partially ordered set of events or something like that. Maybe there's not a total order. Maybe there's weaker orders than what the presentist thought, and so on and so forth. But there's temporal structure. That kind of Parmenidean presentist would deny all that.
You could have this view in general relativity if you cut out some of the problematic spacetimes, because you could just say all diffeomorphisms from a slice or something, just coordinate changes. So
Yeah, non-fundamental stuff.
Yeah.
This is just a feature of the representation rather than the actual underlying physics. And look, I'm not tempted by the position. I think it's kind of crazy, maybe similarly crazy as Parmenideanism in general, or similarly crazy as solipsism, or who knows. But in a way, these are logically possible positions. And this is really just one short passage in a paper where I just sort of point out the logical possibility of this position.
I'm sorry to say something else, but just since, okay, just to put on the record, I think when you were reasons that I guess I've already said.
Mhm.
Because you seem to be, you seem to think that we can pick it up, we can stick, like we can, you didn't say that moment is the only one that exists, you said the present. And of course, you know, this is a huge question anyway, the present is what the present denotes. So if you think that you can keep saying that, then I think you still mean something different from what I thought.
But an internalist could say there exist two entities, and these two entities are not simultaneous. That would not be open to this kind of presentness.
No, but just because I deny some claim, it doesn't mean I have a positive view of my own.
Oh, sure, yes. I didn't mean to say that I've fully developed a positive view, but I do want to resist the temptation to say that it's just eternalism in disguise or something like that.
I didn't want to make that claim either. My claim about this is exactly the same as before. I'm not sure what we're talking about. On the whole, I don't understand the position.
Yeah, I don't claim that I know fully what we're talking about.
But I mean, of course, it's my choice to look at this thing. Okay, so thank you for that. If no one else wants to have a finger on this, then I will continue. Okay.
I don't think it's okay.
Okay, so that was a side, but an important one, I think. Good. Okay, I want to gesture towards some more recent developments. Actually, partly because you know, some of the people I've worked with, also work in Geneva, actually agree with, for example, Chris and many others, that there is a clear substance to this debate, but for very different reasons. So first of all, following some of Williamson's pronouncements, people have looked to modal logic and tense logic to try and, well, either clarify or redirect the temporal ontology disputes into a different direction, where now the views are transientism. Sometimes something begins to exist and sometimes something ceases to exist, in other words, yeah. So it's a conjunction of chains. And permanentism, always, everything always exists. So, I mean, so the people I was talking about a moment ago, Luis Correa and Sven Rosenkrantz, for example, have written a long defense of the growing block view, where they try to illustrate what the growing block view says using these tense logical means in particular. And yeah, I mean, this is just, it's interesting to me because, so I, you know, as you can imagine right now, I have questions about this too. So for example, you know, on this way of thinking about things, what we called standard eternalism a moment ago becomes a claim that is, let me see, I've written it down. Well, again, that I would think doesn't wear its meaning on its sleeve. It's now a claim that always everything always exists, or always everything is always something, namely a static permanentism. And so, yeah, it's that's an approach where we use these logical tools, intense logical tools. In the end, and this is another thing that another problem that I have with this, it's not so clear that the tense logic actually doesn't work. You might think it does because tense logic, you know, tense is our linguistic handle on the perspectivality that there is in time, right? Tense is things like, actually include aspect as well. So you're listening to a talk right now, or you know, it is now the evening, something like that. All those things, you would think that that means that the perspective of the present is going to metaphysically matter, especially if it's a growing block view they're elucidating, but that's not the case, or so I think. Yeah, and so same questions there. I want to also mention a paper by Natalja Deng, which, well, I'm not sure I completely agree, but I think it's important to engage with for the following reasons. So what they say, effectively, it's It's that there's no point debating what presentism really is or how it should be formulated. It's directed at the Williamson crowd, because there is no core to presentism. There is no distinctive, philosophically interesting feature that makes it right to call a view presentist. Important to engage with, especially if you think that there is a core eternalism that we've just been counting. Okay, so let's move on and come to Kit Fine. So, why? Kit Fine's things. Well, for one thing, I think it is a useful classificatory scheme. It sort of, I think, makes some things clear about the A-B divide. Perhaps another reason is this paper of Oliver that I'm going to talk about and other work in that vein, where there is an ongoing debate for at least people active in that literature about what GR really tells us about the nature of time. So in other words, how much or which aspect of time we are demoted in general relativity, which of course then, by extension will be relevant to what we say about the metaphysics of quantity. And another reason, I think, to look into this a little bit is that actually this is a metaphysical framework that's been developed to make sense of the notion of a vantage point. In other words, to theorize about perspectivality in general. Okay, so let's start with a Pooley quote and counterpoint and basis points, which of course a lot of other people have made too. So I was talking about tense a moment ago, right? And I say you're listening to a talk now, or a talk is happening. Aspect such tense. All these things are linguistic means of expressing perspective in time. Here's first of all, actually, maybe a physics point. Of course, many people feel that there shouldn't be this emphasis on language in metaphysics, in philosophy of time. Certainly, you could say that. I think you can object that about Kit Fine's approach, and I mean, I personally, I'm much more likely to find philosophy of physics interesting, or kind of to look to that, philosophy of language or anything like that. But more to the point, here's Pooley's characterization of the presentist. He says, it's true that the presentist, unlike the B-theorist, doesn't believe that past and future times are distant parts of concrete reality, but that's not because they believe in the existence of only one of the B-theorists many times, a single three-dimensional slice of the B-theorist block. Rather, according to the presentist, the material world is extended in only three spatial dimensions and not in a temporal one. The world is not naturally characterized as the present time. A better characterization of presentism starts with the observation that for the presentist, truth simpliciter is tense. Truth is what is presently true. So if you want to go that way, if you go that way, here's the metaphysical setup. First of all, so Kit Fine really thinks hard about what can be at stake. So it can't just be whether some tense statement is true, because everyone agrees they often are. We need them to navigate the world. It also can't just be whether a complete tenseless description is possible. He says, consider an analogy. Suppose that a complete physical description of the world is possible. That doesn't rule out that there might also be a complete psychological description of the world. So, just the completeness by itself doesn't get a handle on anything dispute-like. Similarly here, complete tense description is compatible with that. Similarly now, if you think about, for example, the distinction between Kaplanian content and character. So, for example, it's the evening now that has a certain character. Given the time at which I'm saying it, it also picks out a certain content. For example, one that says it's the evening at this time, at that date. Now, the question can't just be, does this complete tenseless description entail all the tense statements. Like, is there a tense statement that isn't, it's tense statement that is true but not entailed by this description? Because then we have to ask, well, do we mean the content or the character? If you mean the content, then the answer is yes. If you mean character, the answer is no. That's the whole point of character, the way that Hakan thinks of it. It's evening now. Similarly with my name is Natalia, or there's a chair over there, or unicorns are merely possible. And so Giovan's point here is that that doesn't give us a good test for what's at stake. And not, again, another reason to think that is that it's not specific to time, and some stuff might be, or at least to time and modality. So that's why he lands on this, device that is, I think just about as mysterious as it ought to be, because that's what we're doing, is we're talking about the fit or lack thereof between the perspectivality of our temporal representations and reality, where reality has to be meant with a capital R. And basically all of what comes next when he talks about tensed facts and so on, and when I'm going to talk about tensed facts, and then Oliver Cooley talks about tensed facts, it's supposed to be understood as being about the facts that compose metaphysical reality as opposed to mere reality. Okay, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about what mere reality is?
Yeah, mere reality would be any true statement constitutes a fact. For example, it's evening now, because that's true, all sides have to agree it's true, in some sense a fact, that's a fact, and so mere reality just has to accept, so to speak, as part of itself, all of those facts too.
And metaphysical reality does not. Right.
So that there can be a dispute about what metaphysical reality is like, and Kit Fine actually thinks that is the only way to make sense of this dispute. A dispute about not just what it's like, as we'll see in a moment, kind of about principles that characterize metaphysical reality. That's what the dispute is about. That's the only way to understand it. So, Taggart's paradox is this is his reconstruction. Craig Callender had this paper in Times on Voltage where he said something like, if you want to be cured of thinking there is a real dispute here, try to explain McTaggart's paradox to friends and relations. Part of this therapeutic program. So I'm not going to tell you the original, go and read it, but here's Kit Fine's reconstruction. So we have here the following four principles. Realism, this is not about time, only time, forget about the other metaphysical domains. There are tense facts, think constituting metaphysical reality, fundamental level. So for example, a fact like it's, evening now, 5:46, and those change. But, okay, so now let's be careful. Here's some other principles that you may or may not also hold if you're a realist. Neutrality. No time is privileged. That's of course going to sound like something no realist wants to hold. In fact, the standard realist rejects neutrality. In other words, the tense facts that constitute reality are not oriented towards one time particular. And now, here come the kind of most discussed, I think, probably principles. So their significance is that you can give them up, according to Fine. Absolutism. The constitution of reality is an absolute matter. That is, it's not relative to a time or temporal standpoint in any sense. And coherence. Reality is not contradictory. It's not constituted by facts with incompatible content. Okay, so the standard realist, standard atheist rejects neutrality and gets out of the tension that way. So I haven't told you the tension. The tension would quite simply be, it's evening now and it's morning now. Or, you're listening to a talk now, you're having dinner. You can't uphold all of those principles at once, is the idea. At least not if the reality is as variegated as it tends to be, as it tends to seem to be. Okay, so what we have here is standard realist and then two non-standard realist positions. Fragmentalism has been particularly widely discussed, partly in connection with ways to mitigate the conflict with relativity theory. And external relativism is the one that gives up absolutism, and that's the one that really, I believe, at least in that paper, favors. So, out a little bit. Here's the setup. He asks, is the objective passage of time compatible with relativistic physics? He says there are two easy routes to an affirmative answer. One, provide a deflationary analysis of the passage compatible with the block universe. Or two, argue that a privileged global present is compatible with relativity. One doesn't take passage seriously, two doesn't take relativity seriously. What he's after is something that takes both seriously. And I want to also put this John Norton quote here. Time really passes. You all know it. Nothing fancy is meant by that. It's just that future events will become present and then drift off into the past. It's just a passive experience about the way time is, objectively, independently of us. So Hui is construing this, as I have been all along, as being about, well, this a-theoretic process, something that only a realist about tense can accommodate, can posit. Now, I'm interested in a position, or kind of position, and you've read the Ismail paper, which is sort of close to the first route that we calls, providing a deflationary account of passage, one that fits into the block universe. It's for all these reasons also known as tenseless passage. I actually don't think it's an easy way out. More on that tomorrow or the day after. Now, in the spirit of telling you about past work, so I once argued for tenseless passage in something like the following way. So Fine says standard realism has a problem. If you're a realist, what you want is to capture the dynamicity of time, right? But as soon as you give up neutrality, your collection of tense facts is skewed towards one time. And that's just a static block with a privileged center. You haven't, captured the dynamicity. And so I put it a little less strongly. I don't think it's a static view, but I do think there's a point here which I would put as follows. There's a limit to what the theory can display. There's a limit to how much of the dynamicity can be displayed in the metaphysical theory, which means, or that was the idea, that one reason not to think of tenseless passage as not giving us the real thing, the robust passing of time. In other words, the two are more on a par with each other. I don't currently rest the case for tenseless passage on this, but I guess I am still nonetheless on board with the point. It's something like this. You can have one collection of tense facts and then later another, but you can't have the transition between them in your collections of tense facts. Just like you can't capture the in-between by positing a temporal relation. There was an aside. Here's the key to. I want to just walk you through this paper because I think, especially if you're interested in finding out the fate of various metaphysical positions in physical theories, I think it's relevant. So Hui includes in the A theory, or the realist view, the idea of a genuinely open future, which I'm also happy with. And now, basically he argues that of the various A theories, it's only non-standard realist theories, I'll remind you in a moment exactly what they said, but kind of ones that don't give up neutrality, that are compatible with relativity, because they don't require global nouns. And yeah, so I come to the argument in a moment, but here's the end point. He likes a particular external relativism, which says, okay, there are tense facts. They are not skewed towards one time. So there's a collection of tense facts in this constituting this moment and constituting the moment we were talking about earlier, and all the different moments. And now we come to a point which, so this was part of my argument in that paper. Again, I feel like I can't understand this. I can't fully make sense of this. The idea is these different tense facts, collections of tense facts, compose reality only relatively to different times. For instance, reality as a whole manifests itself in these different ways. So the idea is, don't think of this as just collapsing into the B theory. We're not saying that there are just tenseless facts at the fundamental level, that at this time, Chris types on his computer, and earlier we talked about this or that, but rather it's still tense fact and they just compose reality relatively to different times. Anyway, that's the view he argues for, and the way the argument goes is, so for genuine openness we need not just nonological underdetermination, but we need it to be indeterminate which of various possible futures will happen, and typically that's thought about using branching models. Now, of course, we must not interpret this branching structure e-theoretically, i.e. as a multiverse. Again, a little bit of an aside, he mentions that so if you are a B-theorist, it's controversial whether this captures genuine openness. I think that maybe be relevant tomorrow. This is how the Everettian interpretation used to be thought of as positing this kind of multiverse. There were other developments later, but yeah. So anyway, for Cooley's project, don't think of it that way. It's not that this whole branching structure exists. And now, also don't do this. If you're an atheist, you could be tempted to pick out, so to speak, the actual history through the structure. So you'd have a linear ordered sequence of subtrees, but then you would think that reality itself has a branches dropping off, branch attrition, and he thinks that's problematic. Instead, do this Feinian relativist thing. Think each subtree represents a collection of tense facts holding relatively to some time, or relative to some space-time point. So that sums up the view. The key is that all you can deduce as of one time, from one collection of tense facts, is that there will be a future, not which one it is. And so, Cooley thinks that means that this is different from a B-theoretic view. It's not a block universe, and it's very coherent and thoroughly relativistic. And he also mentions, this was around in 2013, but in that paper he also mentions that sequential growth dynamics in set theory certain versions of this can be understood analogously to that dynamics, which again, he thinks the way that it's been presented by the physicists involved is problematic, but there is a non-standard realist way of making sense of it that does work. Okay, maybe just a final comment on this. So Kip Fine, remember he says, the standard realist can't capture the dynamicity, right? And that's what realism is for. Kip Fine says non-standard realism is better off. It's like, we have at least assembled all the relevant nows, but it's still not enough. He says, suppose you do the same about personality, I'm called Natalja, I'm called Chris, all these kind of persons. It's not like you will end up with a passage of people. So, still not enough even by finding lights. So overall, this is a direction that I suppose for metaphysical reasons I haven't been tempted to go in, but you know, if you put aside those metaphysical criticisms, I don't know what, yeah.
Would this count as a non-robust passage?
No, he's after robust passage. The idea is that this is atheoretic, genuinely atheoretic.
Okay, but you think it's not?
No, I agree that it would be. I have argued that it's not fully intelligible. Although, I'll tell you this, given my current view, I don't know if I can still uphold that criticism, but we'll get to that. Okay. So, maybe if we have time, I'll also do this, or should borrow, what is the time situation? I didn't.
So it's actually almost 6.
Okay.
We did start at around, I think, was it 4:30? So we're getting close.
We're getting close to the end.
One
So,
hour and a half.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it works either way, that I can pick things up for the second masterclass here, or I can, I don't know, do another 5 minutes. It's up to you.
5 minutes would be okay.
Okay, all right. So then let me talk a little bit about that final part, which leads into what I will be talking about for the rest of the time, tomorrow and the day after. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about this methodological vision of great calendars because I like it. Maybe that's a little bit surprising since I've worked on the ABCs quite a lot. But here's the vision. So he thinks there is a genuine project about explaining, the features of manifest time. All that stuff that we just said is important, is difficult, the phenomenology, which is temporal experience. There are various features of manifest time, to use the several terms, that don't match up to physical time, says Callender. Now, how do we go about, explaining this or filling this explanatory gap? And I'll come back to this project later on. But anyways, what he says is use whatever discipline is helpful, but not the ABCs. Like there's that chapter that is entitled "Moving Past the ABCs." There's also an R series over there that's in there. Okay, now I don't ask you to read all of this. Let me just read out the read this. I move away from some of these analytic categories, not to be difficult, but rather firmly that this is the way forward in philosophy of time. The models being developed don't do much explanatory work, and the standards of evidence for or against a particular model are insensitive to the ultimate goal of philosophy of time. Okay, so here's the thing. I guess I just want to explore in the rest of these masterclasses, and generally now kind of going forward, I am interested in how we could get there. I'm interested in what I'll call a sort of letter-free version of philosophy of time. I don't think that I have seen a way there yet. I'll tell you about why I don't think Callender gets there in his book. But I'm interested in seeing how it can be done. Why? Well, there's a certain kind of, I think, motivation that maybe comes from having been immersed in these discussions. But I just to put an alternative out there. And of course, okay, so now let's talk a little bit about naturalism, and then we'll stop. So naturalism is somehow probably in the background of a lot of our various approaches to philosophy, even the approach to philosophy of time. First of all, of course, let me say this first. It's not easy to say what naturalism amounts to beyond the sort of respect for or the wish to be guided by science. There's both a content component and a methodological component. Not easy to pin down. Nina Emery, in her book on naturalize metaphysics, says that in terms of the content, most metaphysicians try not to endorse metaphysical theories that outright conflict with the content of our best scientific theories. I think that's probably right, and I agree that's a good thing. But then it's not always easy to say what the content is. That's a philosophical endeavor. As far as methodology is concerned, I'm actually not sure that I really think it's always a good idea to think of science and philosophy as methodologically of a piece. I think that the kind of teamwork is often really fruitful, and I don't know, maybe that the differences in method can be good to keep in mind, that actually does more justice to both science and philosophy. In other words, I may not be a naturalist in every salient sense. However, I think that moving past the ABCs is a worthwhile goal, or at least seeing how it can be done. And that's where I will start tomorrow. Yeah, sure. Actually, how is it again?
On the top, maybe, and the.
Sorry.
No, it's on the. Yeah.
This one?
No, on the left. On the right. On the right. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Is that the one you meant?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a bit quick.
To say expressionism of a piece, I'm not sure it's always a thing of philosophy and science.
Right, so what what I am reacting to there is this idea that I also find in Emery's book, that, there's also the methodological component of naturalism, which is that mathematicians should only employ the methods of science.
Yes. I see.
I mean, this is not something that, well, so this is about our motivations. Okay.
I mean, I find it fairly bizarre to think that philosophy and physics are methodologically the same. I mean, obviously we don't have labs, we don't perform calculations normally.
What about theoretical science?
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's more like there's a continuum of methods in a way, some of which in the theoretical sciences are getting closer to the way we work in philosophy.
Yeah.
And
Suppose that somebody asked, would you say that on this continuum, basically metaphysicians shouldn't employ any
any
methods?
continuum is a wrong word, spectrum, let's say spectrum.
Okay. Anyway, I was going to ask, are there any distinctive places on the spectrum, distinctive to philosophy, that therefore metaphysics can employ? I guess
So we're
sometimes-
distinct,
yes.
we're of a different piece than science insofar as our methodology does not include certain like lab methods or experimental methods and so on and so forth, but maybe still close to some sort of more theoretical modes of scientific work.
Okay, that suggests to me that you could endorse methodological naturalism. Is that what you mean? Because you're just saying there are certain things that are not done in metaphysics, but not certain things that are only done in metaphysics.
Right, so I guess we do both sides. That I'm a little bit less sure. But maybe,
I don't think theoretical scientists use Hegelian dialectics.
well,
Philosophers might.
well, okay, it's been a while since I used that last, but
Okay, I don't go as far as that, I think. Anyway.
I mean, traditionally, I would also often like to distinguish between humanities as a more reflective and say philosophy, science, kind of just, some level below.
good to have a hierarchy.
Maybe the meta level, so to speak, below, right? And Philosophy recently had this Aeon article where he describes somehow, or compares somehow, also like Butterfield does, like this philosophy of physics as being like theory of, how to say, art, music.
Oh, yeah.
What is it? Like, what do you call it?
Yeah, art criticism.
Art criticism, something like this, which is then in a way very different from art if you phrase it like this.
Thanks.
And it's really, he also has all those elements about aesthetics and just sorting things. And isn't it much more also a philosophy of even like even where we want to get to speak to the grounds of what the world is, much more pluralistic in a way, much more interested in playing around with different angles and so on, and this methodologically kind of not completely, but kind of declared more uniform way of science. But,
It's the idea that philosophers of physics or philosophers in general are to physicists as art critics are to artists.
And giving like this is not very helpful, you could say, because of course then it's not really what we are looking for, because artists are still very there's something to it, that's like this, This is
There was a view on article by James
just now. I mean, like this, the analogy highlights the difference between the two. That might be a technique, because you could say somehow philosophy of physics is after all not thinking about some activity like this. It's more thinking also about a field of physics, right? So that it's more, so maybe it's not a perfect analogy.
It's something to think about. Thank you.
So James Reed, you said that?
It's Neon. Neon is like a popular, really kind of good popular article that some philosophers have written.
I should look at that.
Alrighty.
Thank you.